This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 763 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. The Prospect Guide is done, and the Late Round Draft Guide is available for pre-order. You can purchase both of them over on lateround.com. The Prospect Guide gives you what you need for your rookie drafts, and the Draft Guide is a huge strategic breakdown for season-long leagues here in 2023. You get everything that you need for your redraft leagues. And if you're worried it's not going to be worth it, just know that last year's Late Round Draft Guide, in its first year of existence, ended up winning the Fantasy Sports Writers Association Award for Best Publication. So there's at least something pointing to it being worth it. Anyway, check them both out over on lateround.com. Now let's get to these mailbag questions. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @JacobDeal_film. It says, what's your opinion on drafting for value over need in rookie drafts? The answer to this is almost always drafting for value. That's the direction that I almost always go in. There are times where you may be looking at two players within the same tier, or maybe just one tier apart, and the one player who's ranked a little bit lower fits your roster build a lot better than the other. That's fine. That's not that big of a deal if you go with that inferior player. Especially when you're in the later rounds of your draft. At that point, it really doesn't matter. But when you're forcing the issue, that's where I think there's a problem. When you're forcing the need issue. Like if you don't need a running back and you really need a wide receiver and you pass on Bijan Robinson for Jackson Smith and Jigba, that's a problem. That's bad process. That's drafting for need rather than value. And look, the fact is, there are fewer alternatives in rookie drafts versus your season-long drafts or a startup draft. The player pool is smaller, meaning it's then harder to actually draft for need because you're less likely to find an alternative who's at the same level as the player that you're thinking about taking. Like in a redraft league in the first round, there are typically multiple running backs and wide receivers that you're choosing from. In a rookie draft, there's only one Bijan Robinson. The gap from Robinson to the rest of the pool is much more significant, generally speaking, than what you're going to see from a redraft league. You can always fix your dynasty roster with trades. Draft for value and trade for need. This next question is an email from Eric. It says, from listening to things, a lot of people keep saying that a rookie's landing spot isn't great in 2023, but could be great in 2024. Tajay Spears is one example, or Marvin Mims if the Broncos cut Sutton after this season. Which of this year's rookies would you go for in dynasty drafts based upon having a clearer path in 2024, i.e., who are the best stashes? Now, I think some stashes are more obvious than others. People are pretty high on Chase Brown, who I think is good. Tajay Spears is one who you mentioned. But instead of going with those more obvious players, I'm going to give you three lower key ones. One of them is Charlie Jones. He's an older prospect who really only gave us one big productive season in college, and that was last year when he transferred to Purdue. But T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd are both free agents next year. So if Jones shows up, he could allow the Bengals a little bit more flexibility. Now, he didn't look great in my prospect model because of that late breakout, but he's at least someone to consider throwing a dart at. One player I found myself taking a ton this year, though, is Tyler Scott. It's wild to me that his teammate at Cincinnati, Trey Tucker, got drafted before him. Scott had by far the better production profile. He has a reasonable breakout age, and he's an early declare. He landed in Chicago, and Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool are free agents next year. So if Tyler Scott comes in and plays well, he could realistically have a starting role in 2024. And then one player I haven't talked about at all on this show, or even in my prospect guide because he didn't go to the NFL Combine. I'm kind of intrigued by Lou Nichols. A.J. Dillon is a free agent next season. Aaron Jones should be around, but he's going to be 29 years old in December. The Packers took Nichols in the 7th round out of Central Michigan, and he really has an impressive production profile. He's 220 pounds, and he had a best season reception share in college of almost 15%. After plugging him into my model because he wasn't in the model pre-draft, his top comp is Jay Ajayi, which isn't that bad of a comp when you consider where Nichols was drafted. Ajayi had some fantasy production throughout his career. Anytime we get size with a receiving profile, we should pay attention. He's clearly just a dart throw. The chance of him hitting is not very high, but there are definitely reasons to believe that he should be rostered in Dynasty, at least in deeper leagues. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Clay. It says, "Hi, JJ. Your prospect guide didn't include Khalil Shakir, which means he's statistically unlikely to be fantasy relevant. I can't ignore the constant hype drum beat, though. Is he a buy or a sell?" So here's the deal. I've gotten questions about the prospect guide and Khalil Shakir a ton over the last couple of months, and I totally understand why. But in the prospect guide in the year 2 model section, I had to draw the line somewhere with which players would be featured. And he just missed the mark. Because his year 2 score doesn't look that good. I don't know how it would look good. He barely played as a rookie. And it's not like he was a day 2 pick last year. Now, with that being said, my prospect model did like Shakir quite a bit last year. For a day 3 pick. He was one of my highest drafted rookies last year. It was him, Kyle Phillips, and Isaiah Pacheco. One of his comps in the model was Cooper Kupp. I thought that he would go earlier than he did in the draft, and then the Bills just didn't use him that much. So my general take on Shakir is this. I like him as a player, and I am absolutely rooting for him. I've got him stashed in leagues. And I think that you should too if he's cheap enough. But we have to ground ourselves with reality here too. Shakir has a year 2 model score in the 67th percentile. Among all the wide receivers in the prospect model with a year 2 score in the 70th percentile or lower, only one has given us a season of 14 PPR points per game or more in year 2 or year 3. That was Allen Hurns. And then only Cecil Shorts and Willie Snead, along with Hurns, have given us a season of 12 or more PPR points per game. If you were with me last year, you know that I talked about Shakir the same way that I talked about Isaiah Pacheco. I was very high on him. So I'm sitting here right now saying that it's probably going to be an L. I mean, he was a day 3 pick, so whatever. But the chance of him really hitting is not very great. And I don't want to just hold on to a take like that when we have this new information. That new information being that he didn't do a whole lot last year. And that's important. There's a lot of signal to that. Wide receivers who do very well during their rookie season, do anything during their rookie season, they have better hit rates down the line than guys who don't do a lot at all. Now, with all that being said, I do think he can be a productive enough player. The Bills didn't add a slot guy in the draft, though they're going to use Dalton Kincaid there in some way. Shakir can walk in and maybe see a 12 to 15% target share this year. So if you want to get him for very little, I'm totally for it. Even though his chance of hitting isn't very high. It's not like the market is sitting there, though, saying that his chance of hitting is high. This isn't like Gabe Davis last year. You don't have to spend a lot to get Khalil Shakir. So I'm never going to stop someone from getting him, especially because I liked him as a prospect. I still think there's some shot for him to be like a wide receiver 3 type. But a true difference maker in fantasy football, that seems unlikely based on history. This next question is from Brandon on Patreon. It says, "How do you go about projecting a player like Calvin Ridley who missed significant non-injury related time and is also on a new team?" You cross your fingers and you hope for the best. In all seriousness though, projections are not an exact science. There's a lot of subjectivity that goes into them. I've done shows in the past on the process of building projections. I think the most recent was episode 373 with Rich Rebar. That was back in 2020. But we're making educated guesses when we're building them. I mean, maybe educated guessing isn't the right way to phrase it. If you have a projection system and it's thoughtful and it works off of the right things, that's going to be better than someone building projections manually. Like with my projections, I start at the team level and I work my way down to the quarterback level, and then I get to divvying things up between running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And to get the team level numbers, I've got some regression related formulas that I use. To help with quarterback numbers, it's the same thing. And then the big thing to figure out with the skill position guys is market share statistics. Target share and backfield share. That's what drives a player's projection most because volume drives production. So some players are easier to project than others. We have a pretty good idea of the type of target share and efficiency a player like Justin Jefferson is going to see this year. His touchdown total might fluctuate a little bit because that's less stable, but from a volume perspective, he's been in the 28 to 29% target share range in each of his last 2 seasons. Projecting him for a 28% target share isn't that much of a stretch. That's what we've seen over the last 2 years. Calvin Ridley's projection is going to have more volatility. And this goes for any player who's in a new environment or who's coming off an injury. You're looking at what they did historically. On the volume front for Calvin Ridley, he saw target share per game rates of 15% and 17% as a first and second year player. And then he blew up in year 3 and he had a 25% rate. He started to see good volume in his 4th year, but he didn't play that much. And then last year he was out. So chances are he's not going to be under a 15% target share, right? We know that's his absolute floor. He did that as a rookie. He's never been below that number during his entire career. He may not get to a 25% share though. When you consider that he's only done that once across an entire season, he hasn't played in like 2 years, and he's on a new team. And then you factor in the competition on said team. So when you play it all out, Ridley's likely in that 21, maybe 22% target share group. And then from there, you can use some regression analysis to figure out his yards per target, which feeds into his total yards, which feeds into his projected touchdowns. So that's a very generalized way of talking about projections. But hopefully it helps a little bit with a player like Calvin Ridley. This next question is from @FF_Coop99. It says, is it better to draft for landing spot or build / draft capital / etc. when drafting late round running backs, in your opinion? Is a Zach Evans or Sean Tucker in a climbable depth chart better than an Evan Hall, Chase Brown, Eric Gray, who are buried but statistically better bets? Well, I think we should first understand that there's some opinion on what's a good landing spot and what's a bad landing spot. Like you mentioned Chase Brown here and him being buried. But he could emerge sooner than we think. I think the landing spot in Cincinnati is actually a really good landing spot. But the way I approach the late rounds at running back is that if there's a screaming value or like an obvious late round pick that I really like, I'll get him regardless of landing spot. Aaron Jones back in the day is a really good example of that working out. But if there's not that obvious guy, and I don't think there's a ton of them this year, I think it makes plenty of sense to elevate later round running backs based on landing spot and immediate opportunity. Because your goal with those types of players is to watch them appreciate in value, to extract value from them. We know the hit rates for 3rd and 4th round rookie picks is really, really low. So rather than hold on to these assets and just hope for the best for multiple years, it's important to know what we've got, but also to see them get better in value immediately. Of course, you can combine those two things too, and you get a very obvious target when those two things collide. That's what Isaiah Pacheco was for me last year. He was someone I liked more than the consensus as a player, and he also had a great landing spot. But overall, it's definitely a it depends type of situation and answer. If there's someone who's obviously great, go get him. If a player is just maybe a little bit better based on your process, but he's buried, likely won't get that much opportunity, it's not a bad idea to side with the guy who might be a little bit worse, but has a clearer path to year 1 playing time. Because again, it's a late round dart throw. We want to see these guys appreciate in value. And at the end of the day, it's not like our evaluations are going to be right all the time anyway. This last question is a short one. It's from @AustinAbbottFF. It says, JJ, why do you only date back to 2011? Is that when you started collecting data for your model? So yeah, I always date things back to 2011. You guys hear me talk about that all the time on this show. Since 2011, all the way back to 2011, etc., etc. I go back to 2011 though, because that's around the time that the NFL became a more pass-friendly league. When I relate current data across some sort of time frame, I want to do it in a way where I'm not comparing the 2022 season to like 2001. Because those are two totally different eras in the NFL. Things are a lot different now. I also think it's helpful to have some sort of stopping point with data. I'll go further back if need be, and I use data beyond 2011 to test things. But for purposes of communication and the things that I talk about in some of the studies that I do, I found that 2011 is just a logical place to start. That's all it is. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.